We're going to the Royal Festival Hall for our next concert. Highgate Choral Society promoting a concert on the 7th of March, which celebrates my 65th birthday, which fell in January. And it's a wonderful celebration because I get the chance to conduct Vaughan Williams's C Symphony, which is the major work we're performing. And when we were thinking about the rest of the concert, it suddenly became a C concert, and we're going to begin with the C Interludes from Peter Grimes by Benjamin Britten, and then I have written a piece about the sea as the second item. So let's start with the Britten. Peter Grimes was the opera which put Britten, the composer, on the map in 1945, and he had discovered the poem The Borough by George Crabbe when he was in America in the early 40s. They'd read an article, Piers and Britten, about the poem, and they were intrigued to know the content, and so found themselves a second-hand copy and read this story of Peter Grimes, the outcast in a society which reminded Britten very much of his Aldborough homeland. It made him very homesick, and he knew that when he got back home, he really was going to write an opera based on this story of Peter Grimes. And the opera is very much centred on the sea and the village life there, and so there are these 4 orchestral passages which Britten then arranged as a suite of 4 interludes. In fact, there's a 5th one, a Passacaglia. And one of the interludes is the dawn at the beginning of the opera. One of them is the storm, and they give colour to the opera and are moments when we can reflect on the action so far. Now, I said the opera was performed in 1945. It was performed for the reopening of Sadler's Wells and was a huge success for Britten. It put Britten, the composer, on the map and established him as a major player in the operatic world, but it also put Great Britain on the map, because if we think about the history of opera in Britain, it's a bit unfortunate. Nothing from the recent past has stayed in the repertory at all, and suddenly Peter Grimes was an international hit. It was a hit in this country and abroad, and of course we know now that Britten wrote many more operas afterwards, all of which were hugely successful. Highgate Choral Society have commissioned me to write a piece for this concert, and so once we had the C Symphony and then the C Interludes in place, staring me in the face was my piece had to be a C piece. To be really honest, I wanted to write a requiem like the Verdi Requiem, and one day, no doubt, I will. But a C piece was a good idea, and there were certain poems I really wanted to set. Crossing the Bar, I particularly wanted to set, and because the children's choir are taking part, I wanted them to sing Sea Fever by John Masefield. I also wanted the psalm They That Go Down to the Sea in Ships as part of the text. You can see I was trying to get variety of the different movements. And then a little bit of a dilemma. I felt that perhaps it could begin and end with a sea shanty. I looked at the words of sea shanties, and some of them are quite ribald, so I wasn't sure that I wanted to go that far. But anyway, I've solved that by quoting Haul Away Joe, but not the verses. And they are at the bookends, if you like, at the beginning and end of the piece. And so the next dilemma was, what else? And I rather luckily discovered, by playing again the Golden Legend, which I'd recorded, Sullivan's Golden Legend, that Longfellow wrote a section in that poem about the sea and the stars, how the stars were listening to the sound of the sea. And so that formed naturally another section, sung by the children in that case. And what I knew I needed now was a fast section, a 2-minute section I had in my mind of fast and brittle music. And I discovered again Wild Nights, the poem by Emily Dickinson. And so I was complete, and the piece was written in a way, in that sort of slightly piecemeal way, with some sense of the overarching shape in my mind. And so what I'm hoping is that within those 20 minutes we're going to get the smell of the sea from a shanty point of view, and also some reflection on what the sea means to the poets and indeed to us all. I think it's received wisdom that Vaughan Williams was a late starter as a composer, and that's rather a foolish thing to think, because a number of composers, Bruckner, let's say, and Janacek, were also perhaps late starters. I think what we mean is that his early works were derivative. Vaughan Williams' early works, which he suppressed himself, in fact, the chamber music, if we now play it, and they are all recorded, we can hear that he's very influenced by Parry and Stanford and the German tradition. And then in the beginning of the 20th century, in the 1900s, he begins to find his own voice. And this is the point about suddenly we arrive at a Vaughan Williams that we know has a distinctive voice and has his own sound world. And in 1910, the two major pieces which put him on the map were the Tallis Fantasia, which was performed at the Three Choirs Festival, and then the huge Sea Symphony, his Symphony No. 1, which was performed at the Leeds Festival. And this Sea Symphony is a gigantic piece, 70 or 80 minutes long, 4 choral movements. It is in fact a symphony because it's in 4 movements. The second movement is the slow movement, and the third movement is a scherzo, very much in an ABA scherzo pattern. And so in that sense it's a symphony. But I think if we looked at the design of it and the shape of the movements themselves, we can see that he's being rhapsodic, he's not following sonata form. And the reason he'd found his own voice, I think, is because over a period of time he'd collected folk music from this country, he'd looked at old music by Byrd and Tallis, he was fascinated by Elizabethan music, but he'd also studied for 3 months in Paris with Ravel. And Ravel remarked of him that he was one of his only pupils who wrote music that didn't sound like Ravel. And I think we can see that Vaughan Williams was finding his own voice. And actually in the Sea Symphony we can hear echoes of Elgar, we can hear echoes of Parry and Stanford, but there is a new sound world there. And in that scherzo I mentioned, there is very much the French influence because we can hear the whole tone scale and the sort of impressionistic harmonies. And we might think that there are a lot of sea pieces around at this time. La Mer has already been written, and I don't know whether Vaughan Williams knew that Debussy piece, but there are also the sea pictures of Elgar and then Stanford's Songs of the Sea and Songs of the Fleet, and then rather important piece, an orchestral suite by Bridge called The Sea. So here we are in 1910 with Vaughan Williams, his first symphony, a very major work, and it's the work that puts Vaughan Williams very much on the map. And we know now that, of course, he lived until 1958, was a very senior man at 85, writing his last symphony, his 9th symphony. And perhaps we remind ourselves too that having said he was slow developing, there were the odd pieces which showed what was to come toward the unknown region. And that reminds us that he's setting the words of Walt Whitman. Now, Whitman's poetry was not well known in this country, but Vaughan Williams had discovered it, shared it with Holst, and in fact Holst and Vaughan Williams were pupils together and spent a lot of their time comparing notes on the pieces that they'd written. So they would write something and send to the other and want them to criticize it. And the pair of them set Walt Whitman throughout their career. And the interesting thing about Whitman's poetry, in what it's expressing or what it's trying to express, this big picture of the world and how we fit in it, but also because the poetry itself is not structured. If you look at it, it looks in a way like poetic prose. It freed up composers to write in a much more rhapsodic way. It didn't constrain them by the length of the lines. And so Vaughan Williams, with this text, found the perfect vehicle for him, and he chose some of the best poems of Whitman about the sea for his gigantic Sea Symphony.